Last 4 or 5 that I've started to integrate visual images in my lecture. And I can't imagine now teaching without, I can't imagine how I made people sit still for 50 minutes and listen to me blather on without having something to look at. Right? But I think those visual images are much more, they make the story much more compelling to people and memorable. And the other thing, I keep using this word story. You know, a lot of professional historians are a little uneasy about saying that what we do is tell stories, because that seems to suggest that we make it up. I mean, children tell stories, right? But in effect, that's what we do. We are offering interpretations, which means that we are assembling events in order to have in a broader arc, in order to lead us to draw certain kinds of conclusions or to see things from a particular kind of way. And one of the great joys of teaching history that I think gives us an advantage over every other colleague we have, human beings love stories. And stories don't have to be simple. In fact, if you think about it, whether this is a story your family told you, or whether it's the Odyssey, or whether it's your favorite novel, some of the most profound insights we can get about other human beings come to us in the form of stories. So a lot of what I try to do is not only give visual images and tell stories, so they're analytical stories, but I also try to make sure that my lectures and my teaching in general is populated with people, because I think that also makes it easier. I can sit here and talk about, okay, here are 2 competing theories of how you organize around civil rights, but I can also show you 2 people who embody 2 different traditions, and you're much more likely to remember it. Anyway, what I'm going to start with today, and what we're going to do today, we'll talk a little bit later. These are just some readings that we thought would be very useful for you, and I'll run through them perhaps later. But if you recall the last time you did speak to me, or I spoke to you, it was not the previous, but 2 previous workshops ago, I tried to talk about the civil rights movement in a very broad terms, what I call the long civil rights movement. Not simply the civil rights movement that goes from Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 to Martin Luther King's assassination in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968. And that reminds me, that was actually a question on your pretest. What was Martin Luther King doing in Memphis in 1968? Sanitation workers. And that's actually a really significant, illustrative date, right? One of the things that King said near the end of his life, as the movement had achieved a Civil Rights Act and a Voting Rights Act, and thus, at least on paper, formal equality for black people. It's hard to imagine, 5 years before, people have been risking their lives to try to sit at a lunch counter to get a cup of coffee. But having achieved that, there was a kind of growing recognition of the immense inequalities that existed. As King said, what's the use of being able to sit at a lunch counter if you don't have money to buy a hamburger? So where would the movement go after 1964, 1965? And it's very significant to think of Martin Luther King, what he was doing in that very last campaign of his life. In any event, what I tried to say was, look, we need to think more broadly. Black people didn't just simply wait passively around until the Supreme Court said that there would be desegregation. In fact, there had been a struggle by black people against the regime of Jim Crow, which had settled in after the end of Reconstruction. From its beginning, in some ways, I mean, one of my colleagues, Charlie Cobb, who you're going to actually hear a little bit about today, when Charlie teaches us the students, he said, look, this started, when did the Civil Rights Movement start? It started the first day a slave ship arrived. And there's a way in which it continues today, precisely because of the racial disparities that continue to exist in our society. And so I tried to set the Civil Rights Movement in a broader story about this period after the Second World War. I talked, for example, about the Cold War, and the ways in which the Cold War was a very important context for the Civil Rights Movement. Because part of what happened in the context of the Cold War is if you're in the middle of a battle for the hearts and minds of people in India and Asia, or Southeast Asia, and Africa, in a battle with the Soviet Union, it's really bad publicity for you in that battle when a person in India or Africa opens a newspaper and sees Bull Connor's police dogs attacking children. So a lot of the impetus for civil rights actually came, or the fact that the federal government was belatedly, some ways reluctantly drawn in on the side of civil rights, had less to do with Kennedy or Johnson's, or particularly Kennedy's, concern for black people per se, than it had to do with fears of the way in which the reputation of the United States internationally was being bruised by this. Now, the Cold War, if you recall, I also spoke about, cut both ways, because it also created enormous suspicion against anyone who seemed to question the way things were in America. And the label communist, he's a communist, would be used particularly in Mississippi, where every civil rights worker was immediately labeled a communist by the authorities of the state. But the main thing I tried to do or to set up was, look, there's a lot about the civil rights movement that we think we know that maybe we don't. Because what I'm particularly interested in, this is my own research, is not simply understanding what happened 50 years ago in this state, but also understanding what the meaning of those events is and how it has changed over the course of 50 years. A lot of historians draw a distinction, and I sometimes do too, between history and memory. I'm less interested in a sense, what actually happened than in how we tell the story of what happened. And one of the things that I'm concerned about is that the main way most Americans know or tell the story about civil rights is about Martin Luther King. It's a great charismatic leader. We have a holiday for him every year. He had a dream. Now we all have a dream. And I worry that there's ways in which that particular story doesn't do justice to what happened. It certainly does not do justice to what happened in the state of Mississippi. Mississippi was a place that King did not spend a lot of time. Mississippi, the spearhead of the movement here, was not Martin Luther King. It was people, ordinary people, often people not much older than the students you teach. Often people, sharecroppers from the Mississippi Delta. People who had historically never been asked to speak for themselves, but who were spoken for by other political leaders, whether white or black, whether sympathetic or unsympathetic. The story of the Mississippi movement is a story of ordinary people claiming the right to speak for themselves. There's a biblical verse on this. You'll see it quoted in a letter from Bob Moses, the civil rights movement. The stone that the builders rejected, I have made the cornerstone. That's really the key that I want to get at in talking about the Mississippi movement. In doing this, I'm again going to try to decenter Martin Luther King. I'm going to try to decenter also the kind of movement that Martin Luther King led. Scholars working on the civil rights movement in Mississippi draw a distinction between mobilizing and organizing. I'm not sure you have to use those words, but let me try to explain to you what's at stake in that distinction. By mobilizing, they mean the kind of things that King was involved with in Selma or in the March on Washington, in which leaders, often charismatic leaders, people of great national reputation, in the media a lot, come into a town and rev people up for large-scale demonstrations in public space, often forcing a kind of confrontation with political authorities. And the power of that kind of politics would be vividly revealed in a place like Birmingham, where the movement of children offending segregationist laws was designed to and did indeed provoke an enormous white overreaction of fire hoses and police dogs. Those images, which are still engraved in our minds, were broadcast around the world, ultimately forcing a somewhat timid federal government to begin to try to rally to the side of civil rights. That's not, however, how the Mississippi movement worked. One of the things that's very funny, I've taken TAH teachers from New England on Southern civil rights tours a lot. And when we take them to Alabama, which was King territory, it's easy. Because you go to Birmingham, there's a big museum, they go to Kelly Ingram Park, and they can see all these things. And you can go to Montgomery, and you can see where the bus boycott was, and there's a big museum. And you can go to Selma, and you can see where they crossed Edmund Pettus Bridge. You can cross it, you can go to the big museums, right? This summer, I took a group of New England teachers from Mississippi, through Mississippi. And they were like, where is all this? Where are these museums? Where are these sites? Where are the pictures? And partly that reflects the fact that this state has been somewhat slower than Alabama in trying to both honor, forgive me for saying it, commercialize its civil rights history. But it also reflects that the kind of work that was being done by Mississippi civil rights organizers was very different. This was knocking on doors in small towns, talking to people, asking them to come to a meeting that night in a church. They always called them mass meetings, though initially there might be only 3 or 4 people with the courage to show up. Asking those people, often at risk of their lives, to go down and try to register to vote. Slow, inconspicuous. And in fact, rather than trying to provoke a great conflagration with national media, a lot of that work was being done under the radar at considerable risk to the people who were doing it. So with that overlong introduction, let's get on and look at some pictures. So I thought I would first just show you pictures which will be familiar to you of the kind of familiar story of civil rights that we tell, right? So, Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, a year later in 1955, Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat, catapulting a young minister, Martin Luther King, into national prominence. And again, it was Ella Baker, who I'm going to talk about in a moment, who said, Martin didn't make the movement made Martin. And one of the themes that I was talking about last time, if you recall, was trying to show you the way in which there was a long tradition of political organizing in Montgomery. They ended up tapping King as leader, chiefly because he was new in town and wasn't yet either in anyone's pocket or hadn't been there to antagonize people. But that's the person who now becomes, for us, a synecdoche for, that's a $5 word for you, the one thing embodying the whole, a symbol of the entire movement. Of course, this is 1957 in Little Rock, where ultimately Dwight D. Eisenhower organized the 101st Airborne to come into Little Rock, so 9 people would attend Little Rock High School, Central High School. This was a crucial piece for thinking about Mississippi, the beginnings of a student. 4 students who were students at Greensboro A&T, Greensboro, North Carolina, sitting at a local lunch counter. The sit-in movement spread all over the country. It came last to Mississippi because the risk of violence, which was everywhere, was so much more extreme here. The first sit-ins in Mississippi were, stand to be corrected in this, I think 1961 in Jackson. And there's a picture. And somebody said that they thought this was ketchup. This is actually blood. So it's Ann Moody, a student at Tougaloo College. Her book, Coming of Age in Mississippi, is one of the greatest biographies or autobiographies of black childhood in Mississippi I've ever read, describing her entrance into the civil rights movement. This is actually a white woman who was also a student at Tougaloo College named Joan Trumpauer, who had come down to Mississippi with the Freedom Rides, I'll get to that in a minute, and stayed. And this is a white professor at Tougaloo, John Salter. This is a powerful image. You can work with that image with your students. This particular event went on for something like 3 or 4 hours, while the police stood casually on the side, and while FBI agents stood on the street taking notes. The Freedom Rides, this attempt to test a federal court order or a court decision which had specified that on interstate commerce there was no segregation. So the announcement by civil rights activists initially associated with the Congress of Racial Equality to test this by taking a group of buses into the Deep South. People are often confused about this because CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, had actually run one of these freedom rides in 1947, right after the court decision, which specified that state segregation laws didn't apply to interstate commerce, because that was federal. That's in the Constitution, it's federal. So that if the bus or train was going across a state line, Jim Crow didn't apply, segregation didn't apply. Well, it did. People, as buses crossed the Mason-Dixon line, knew to reshuffle on the bus, and the blacks go to the back, and the whites go to the front. When that was tested in 47, people were arrested. It was tested again in 1961 with these results in Anniston, Alabama, in Birmingham, Alabama, in Montgomery, Alabama. Freedom Riders were set on by mobs, brutally beaten, and had their buses fired on. This, by the way, was the Kennedy administration's response to this was quite interesting. He was about to go to Vienna to meet with Khrushchev for the first time. And suddenly, this is what's on every national newspaper around the world, every international newspaper, every television station around the world. Kennedy's response was to beg for a cooling off period, to urge civil rights workers to stop doing this because they were provoking these confrontations. And he eventually negotiated a deal with the state government of Mississippi that if they would agree not to beat the Freedom Riders, the federal government wouldn't object if they arrested them. So the people arrived, the Freedom Riders arrived in waves at the Greyhound bus station, the Trailways bus station in Jackson. The hotel we were in Jackson, you saw the Greyhound station just across the street. And they were politely arrested and sent up to Parchment Farm. Sometimes not so politely arrested. This is James Meredith integrating the University of Mississippi in 1962. We just this fall celebrated the 50th anniversary of that event. And these are, of course, those iconic pictures of Birmingham, of Bull Connors police dogs, fire hoses. And this, if you prefer happy endings, Lyndon Johnson signing the 1964 Civil Rights Act. You could also find him a year later signing the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Two acts which effectively reestablished the principles that had been enshrined in two constitutional amendments adopted a century before. Remember we talked about the Reconstruction period. There are 3 additions to the U.S. Constitution in Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, and that one stuck. A 14th Amendment establishing, contrary to the Dred Scott decision, that black people were citizens too, that anyone born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. This has become an issue again in this country around issues of immigration. If you're born here, doesn't matter how you got here, 14th Amendment says you are a citizen of the United States. And if you are a citizen of the United States, you are entitled, according to the amendment, to equal protection of the law. Well, that particular constitutional amendment, we talked about this a lot last year, becomes effectively a dead letter. And one of the ways around it for the courts is with this doctrine of separate but equal. As long as facilities are substantially equal, they can be separate without violating the guarantee of equal protection laws. The Voting Rights Act, which Johnson signed a year later in 1965, restored the plain sense of the 15th Amendment, the third of the great Reconstruction Amendments. 1865 is the 13th, 1867 is the 14th, 1870 is the 15th, which extended to black men, just keep in mind, only men could vote this time, the right to vote. It says the right to vote cannot be infringed based on race, color, or prior condition of servitude. And as we know, that constitutional amendment was also mocked by a series of legislative and court decisions, which basically specified, and here this was what Mississippi contributed to jurisprudence, the so-called Mississippi Plan of the early 1890s, that you could in fact disfranchise black people as long as you didn't do so on the grounds of their race, their color, or their prior condition of servitude. So you could make people pay a poll tax. You could make them pass a literacy test. You could make them, in the case of Mississippi, pass a literacy test which included interpreting one of the 256, I think, sections of the Mississippi State Constitution. You could allow the local registrar of voters to determine arbitrarily whether that person had passed that literacy test or not. You could install grandfather clauses which exempted people from the poll tax if their grandfather had been eligible to vote, that is white. All of those things were legitimated by the U.S. Supreme Court. So that by the time the civil rights movement begins to gain traction in Mississippi in the early 1960s, about 6% of the black population of the state was allowed to vote. Counties that had black majorities, in some cases, had 0 registered black voters. So this is the canonical story that we tell, right? And if you prefer tragic to happy endings, I could have ended not with Johnson signing one of those 2 momentous pieces of legislation, but one could end, and we'll visit this place in Memphis, with the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. But the person that I emphasized when we met last time was this person, who I suspect none of you had ever heard of. This is a woman named Ella Baker. And if you ask people who were in the Mississippi movement who the single most important individual in the movement was, who the architect of it was, they will universally tell you Ella Baker. She would resist that label, but in some sense I think she'd be pleased by her relative obscurity. Because her whole argument was that movements weren't built by famous, celebrated leaders. She said famously Martin Luther King. She's the person who said Martin didn't make the movement made Martin. She also said when you have a movement with big, fancy leaders, usually the press made them, and the press can unmake them. She also said strong people don't need strong leaders. Ella Baker was born in North Carolina. She went to school in New York City. She stayed in New York City and began working as a political activist in the 1930s. In the 40s, she began working for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the venerable civil rights organization founded in the early 20th century by W.E.B. Du Bois, among others. But Ella was always out of step with the NAACP. In part, what she wanted to do was build a grassroots movement. In places like Pike County, even Neshoba County, if you can imagine, Holmes County, there were local chapters of the NAACP. People who actually joined this organization when being called an NAACP card could get you killed. To Ella Baker, that was the NAACP. But to most of the people in headquarters in New York, the NAACP was them. It was their big office in New York. It was filing suits like Brown v. Board, the U.S. Supreme Court. And so, again, it was a movement that she felt was failing fundamentally because of its failure to build from scratch. She then went to work in the late 50s with the new organization that had been established after the Montgomery bus boycott, King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. She was also very, very uneasy and unhappy with the style of politics she saw then, which again, she saw, you don't make people strong by teaching them to follow a charismatic leader. You make them strong by helping them discover the resources for leadership, the ingenuity, the wisdom that lay in that community. You don't roll in and try to mobilize them for a big thing and then get on your bus and leave. Because then what have you left? That vision would become the vision of an organization that Ella helped create, SNCC. And that's how everyone called it, SNCC, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The origins of SNCC go back to 1960, and they go back to the sit-ins in Greensboro. When the sit-ins in Greensboro happened, and black students elsewhere saw the step that people just like them had taken, in a sense, those students in Greensboro threw down a challenge to all black students. And throughout the South, soon in more than 100 cities, similar sit-ins had erupted. Well, Ella Baker and others said, look, we now have students in more than 100 cities across the South who are waging these sit-ins against segregation of lunch counters. We really should create a moment where they can get together so they can learn from each other, instead of going along with this in this totally uncoordinated way. So she got Dr. King to give her, I don't remember, I think it was $500, a pittance, to hold a conference at her alma mater, Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. King gave her the money, because King thought, oh, this will be perfect. They'll become the student wing of SCLC. People from the NAACP came and said, this will be great. We'll get them into the NAACP youth structure. But Ella Baker went around the night before the meetings commenced and suggested to the students that they might want to remain independent, that they might have something to contribute as young people. This is why I must tell you, teaching the history of the Mississippi movement in your classrooms is a particular challenge and a particular privilege, because the people you're talking to, that's the people who made the movement here. Forebears, but not much older than them. She famously said at that, it may be that we're here for something more significant than a hamburger. That this may be a movement not just that you consider the lunch counter, but to fundamentally change the structure of power in our society. Out of this came the organization SNCC. Well, I don't think anyone from Mississippi was at that meeting, because the city had not yet started in Mississippi. So some months later, when they were making plans for a second conference, after the students had decided to remain independent and had created an organization of their own called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And again, it's a modest title, isn't it? Just a coordinator. In plans for the second, she sent this young man, Bob Moses, who she had met working as a volunteer at SCLC. Bob Moses, a fascinating figure. He's still alive, spent a lot of time in Macomb, Mississippi. A person of extraordinary moral stature, although he would also hate us making a fuss of him. Bob Moses was a math teacher in New York. He'd also had a graduate degree in philosophy from Harvard. He'd gone south to sort of see what was going on, was working in the SCLC office with Baker, had some of the same qualms about it that she did. And she said to him, you know, we need some students from Mississippi. Why don't you go, get on a bus and go to Mississippi and see if you can figure out what's going on. Now, Ella Baker had networks of connections in Mississippi through her earlier work with the NAACP. The famous one, of course, is Medgar Evers. And now, everyone in Mississippi knows that. If you've flown in and out of Jackson, you've flown in and out of Evers International. This is a picture of Medgar Evers coming out of the service. A lot of black men in this state served in the Second World War, came out of that experience, ready to challenge white supremacy in unprecedented ways. And here he is, a photo 20 years later, not even 20 years later, 15 years later, in his office as president of the Mississippi State chapter of the NAACP. But the main person, Ella Baker, she had this, this old list of people she'd worked with in the local branches. The main person she sent him to was not Medgar Evers, but somebody you've never heard of, named Amzie Moore. Amzie Moore, and again, not a coincidence, had served in the Second World War. Here's Amzie older. Amzie Moore was A-M-Z-I-E. Amzie Moore lived in Cleveland, Mississippi. Was a member of the local chapter of the NAACP. Was a member of another organization now almost completely forgotten, the Southern Regional Council of Negro Leadership. Like a lot of these guys, he was tough as hell. He was smart. People who worked in the movement used to say that Amzie, who had very little formal education, was able to talk and argue with anybody about anything. He owned a gas station in Cleveland, Mississippi, in the heart of the Delta. And he had at various times already run into challenges from authorities because he refused to Jim Crow his back. I mean, that may not seem like much, but it's an act of extraordinary courage. In fact, the Southern Council of Negro Leadership, Southern Regional Council of Negro Leadership, actually started a campaign where they even had bumper stickers that said, "Don't buy gas where you can't use the restroom." Because of that, he was at risk. The house, we can perhaps stop by it when we go through the Delta. There are floodlights all around his house. And often at night, particularly if there were civil rights workers there, he would just sleep or sit by the window while others were sleeping with a gun. Amzie Moore had been involved in the late 40s and early 50s with attempts to register black people to vote. So when Bob Moses showed up at his door and said, well, see, we want to build this stuff, and we want to try to get the citizens going here, Amzie said to him, you know what, I'm fine with this. I admire what you guys are doing, but that's not what I'm interested in. He said, what's at stake here, if we're going to bring real change, we need to be able to vote. You can sit at a lunch company, but as long as the governor, the senators, the state representatives, the mayor, the sheriff, the justice of the peace, the county supervisors, the agricultural extension officers, as long as every single one of them is white and part of the apparatus of white supremacy, we're not going to get anywhere. We're a majority of people living in this country. If we can register people to vote, we can bring real change. Bob Moses, in reflecting on this later, and we've given you in your packet a short excerpt from his autobiography, partial autobiography. That had never occurred to him. Voting. In fact, a lot of the students weren't very interested when he went back, in fact, AMSI went back to the second SNCC meeting to make the pitch for voting registration. A lot of the students said, oh no, we're not into that. That's the establishment. That's the system. We're revolutionaries. We're laying our bodies on the line in these sit-ins and in these freedom movements. But it was this older generation and their encounter with this younger generation and the conversations that took place between them and the willingness of both to listen to one another. That's an important part of this story too. We live in a society where the wisdom of young people and the wisdom of old people are very rarely brought into the same room. That became part of the energy that out of which SNCC grew. Ultimately, after a big fight in SNCC, and every discussion involved days of argument because SNCC involved, there was a decision that, okay, SNCC would have two wings. It would have the direct action wing, which would continue with things like the sit-in and the freedom rides, but it would also have a voter registration. Now, I must say, part of the reason why a lot of students were skeptical about, do we really want to bother with voting, isn't that the establishment? It was also had to do with the response of the Kennedy administration. The response of the Kennedy administration was ecstatic. Great. No one will object if people want to vote. So this will stop people from getting beaten up and blowing up buses. It will get all of this civil rights stuff off the front pages. And people will just go on and vote, and no one could possibly object to that. Well, in Mississippi, they sure could object to that. And it quickly became clear that in Mississippi, voting, trying to vote, was itself a form of direct action, and one that could indeed get you killed. Well, AMSI ultimately concluded that he was not yet, in the region he was, they were not yet prepared to begin to launch a voter registration drive. It was just too violent. But somehow word of this had gotten out to the media, and Jet magazine, the black magazine, ran a story about the new voter registration campaign that was starting through AMSI Moore in Mississippi. So AMSI got a call from one of these other tough old pine nuts. This man, C.C. Bryant, a railroad man, worked on the Illinois Central from Macomb, Mississippi. Also somebody who had been involved in the NAACP. And he said, I hear you've got a voter registration movement going, bring them down here. So AMSI said to Bob Moses, that's a much older Bob Moses, C.C. Bryant, did any of you know him? He passed about 5 years ago. Bob Moses went down to Macomb, and Macomb became the first place in the state where SNCC began a project. This is a voting registration demonstration in Macomb, Mississippi. Stephen, Fortenberry, the test must go. It's not our Stephen Fortenberry. Some other, must have been the registrar of voters in Macomb at that time. Now, some of you live in Macomb, Mississippi. You probably wouldn't think of this as the most likely place to build a political movement. You probably wouldn't think of this as a community rife with powerful, wise, indigenous leaders. But in the SNCC organizing philosophy, Macomb would become an absolutely crucial site. This is a person, some of you may know him as well. There he is, young, this is him now, he's actually not from Pike County, he's from across the county line in a place so small it's not on the map called Chisholm. Hollis Watkins. Hollis Watkins was a high school kid who went to school in Summit, and he was the first local teenager to come and join the movement. He read somewhere that this story is a different version of the story, that either Martin Luther King or Martin Luther King's brother or the Freedom Riders or somebody was in Macomb. So he showed up. Hollis is still an activist in the state of Mississippi. So more sort of, I could set the stage in Macomb a little bit longer, but let me just now talk briefly about one particular event that became very important and we'll learn more about later today. So while SNCC in Macomb was doing voter registration, slow, patient work, trying to get people to be willing to go down to the courthouse, try to register. Often that meant, you know what the courthouse looks like, right? And walking into the county clerk's office in front of God and the world. Everybody knew what you were doing. Hollis and some other young people who joined the movement, they were less interested in this. They were more interested in the direct action wing. So Macomb had a direct action wing as well. They called it the Pike County Nonviolent Direct Action. And actually, a group of them, some 20 of them, decided that they were going to go sit in at the city library. It would have been the first sit-in in Mississippi. He tells a hilarious version of this story because they hadn't done their homework. Well, first of all, two things happened. One was of the 20, on the day the sit-in was supposed to happen, only 2 of them showed up. Because they told their parents what they were going to do. And their parents said absolutely not, because they knew what would happen to them if they tried. Hollis says he didn't tell it. He didn't lie to his parents, he just left out certain information. But the other thing, and he tells a very funny version of this story, the library was closed, so they hadn't done their homework. So he and this other guy went down to the bus station, sat in the waiting room, and were arrested. That, again, threw down a challenge to other black students. And here's another person some of you may know, a woman from Macomb named Brenda Travis, as a young woman today. So Brenda Travis and some of her friends then went back down to the railway station, and they were arrested as well. And by this time, the authorities of Macomb were a bit uneasy, and they called in the principal of the local black high school, of Bergman High School, and they said, shut this down. So Brenda Travis was expelled from the school, and all other students were required to sign a pledge that they would not participate in any sit-ins. In response to that, the students of Bergman High School in 1961 walked out. And we're going to learn about this because we're going to meet today one of the witnesses and participants in that Bergman walkout. And it said something very interesting about SNCC. The students then walked to the SNCC headquarters, which were over a laundry, I think, or a corner store laundry. Was it a grocery store? Yeah. And they basically said, are you coming? To the people who were in the SNCC office. That's an interesting moment, right? Most of the SNCC organizers thought this was a disastrous idea. What the students were going to do, they were going to march downtown. And there was no question that there was going to be an enormous conflagration. It seemed to the organizers of SNCC to be reckless. They also recognized that their attempts to work with adults in the community were not going to get anywhere if those adults thought that the lives of their children were being jeopardized by the team. But if your vision of political leadership is not, I will tell all of these people what they need to do, but I will try to nurture those people's capacity to speak for themselves, and I will listen when they do. Then you do what the people in that SNCC office did, which was march downtown. Well, there was indeed an enormous conflagration. Some people were assaulted. 102 people were arrested. Hollis Watkins, who was at that time over 18, was charged and actually convicted before the conviction was overthrown with 102 counts of contributing to the delinquency of a minor, sentenced to 2 years consecutive on each count. That sentence was overturned. And that was the Berglund walkout. You'll hear more about it. Now I want to talk a little bit about white responses. And I want to be really careful here. You know, one of the things that's one of the defining features of Mississippi to me, and of white Mississippians in particular, but not exclusively, is when an outsider, their term, comes and wants to talk to them about Mississippi, they get really defensive really quickly. And I've had lots of personal experiences of this. People have heard my accent and started telling me all the reasons I was wrong before I've said a single thing. It certainly was the way in which Mississippians responded to Reconstruction. It certainly was the way in which they responded to the challenge of civil rights. If calling civil rights agitators communists, and agitators also belongs in quotation marks, was one of the kind of universal responses to civil rights activism, the other was that they're outsiders, they're agitators. Everything's fine here. People aren't content here until these outside agitators, communists, came in and started stirring things up. These issues are still enormously sensitive, and you still run into enormous amounts of defensiveness. And if you're going to start trying to teach this in your classrooms, you will likely run into some conflict and defensiveness among your students, and you're also quite apt to have some parents get extremely angry when they get a version from their kids of what they were learning in their classes. Now, speaking of for myself, one of the things that where I actually sympathize with at least part of the kind of knee-jerk response that a lot of Mississippians have is it's not like race relations in other parts of the country are all hunky-dory. But there is a way in which Mississippians became in some ways the symbol of the ugliest face of white supremacy. Not only in the nation, but in this, even within the Jim Crow South. And became, you know, in some ways something that the other Northerners, in particular white Northerners, could feel morally superior to. But with that proviso, or that introduction, let's talk a little bit about white resistance. And the main point I want to make here is that it was well-nigh universal. And you're going to have to really think hard about how to teach this. In the same way, frankly, that people in Germany after the Second World War would have to think very hard about what happened here. And I don't say that, I hope I don't say that in any way self-righteously. I think, to be frank, if I'd lived in Mississippi in 1963, I wouldn't have acted much different from anybody else. This is an organization called the White Citizens Council. It was established initially in Greenwood, headquarters then were in Indianola, spread across the South. This was created in response to the Brown v. Board decision. And it was basically designed to stop. Now what the White Citizens Council would do, some people refer to this as the Uptown Klan. What the White Citizens Council would do would be to try to use various kinds of pressures So if somebody went and tried to register to vote, the local newspaper announced a new policy, that there would be a column in the paper every week about the people who tried to register to vote then. And those people would be fired. The bank would call in any credit or their mortgage, all these kinds of things. In addition to the Citizens Council, there was an official arm of the Mississippi state government called the State Sovereignty Commission. Some of you may have looked then at the papers of the State Sovereignty Commission, which basically was a shadow government chaired by the governor of the state that conducted surveillance, essentially a kind of secret police that conducted surveillance on civil rights activists. The Klan also, you know, most white Mississippians, a tiny fraction of white Mississippians were in the Klan. But the Klan did experience a new lease on life. In 1960, there was no operating Klan in the state of Mississippi. But in 62, 63, 64, as civil rights activism began to grow, a new organization, the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan from Mississippi. Here's an application to join them. That's their head, a man named Sam Bowers, who would ultimately die in prison. So here's an application for citizenship in the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi. Would enjoy a new lease on life. Klan violence was particularly strong in Southwest Mississippi. And the threats of violence could be directed not only against black people who were involved in civil rights activism, but also against white people who were seen as not sufficiently supportive of the existing racial regime. So, you know, there were firebombs and stones thrown into the newspaper office here in Macomb because the editor there, a man named Oliver Emmerich, was seen as suspect in his commitment to white supremacy. It's hard today, and I want to set this up because we're also going to have, in addition to a speaker telling us today about the Bergman walkout, a person talking to us about living through that time here and trying to challenge that edifice of white supremacy as a white person. It's very difficult to imagine today the kind of cultural pressures that were brought to bear on people to toe the line. Particularly famous example in the state, in the city of Macomb, where a local family called the Heffners. I think actually their daughter had been Miss Mississippi, so she was pretty, or even Miss America.
Her name was Jan Nave. She was Miss Mississippi.
So this is a pretty prominent family. Met a couple of white civil rights workers who were visiting, and met them at church on a Sunday, and invited them over for dinner, just to hear about what they were doing. And they were run out of town. They were run out of the town of Macomb because they had had two civil rights workers in their home. So that tone created a kind of license for extraordinary violence. This is an interracial group of ministers at a church in Macomb that had been bombed. Macomb became known as the dynamite capital of Mississippi. This is the house in the black neighborhood of Macomb, it's no longer there, where the SNCC field workers were living after it had been firebombed. This is a local tough beating up a white SNCC worker who had come to observe a demonstration. In fact, I think that's Tom Hayden, who would later marry Jane Fonda. So you can insert your own joke there. The point here is that to actually step outside this would have required a kind of courage that I think very few of us possess. So one of the things I think that's somehow crucial when you teach students It's too easy for us when we look back at the past to think, well, gosh, if I'd been there, I would have fought against Hitler. I would have stopped this. I would have been against slavery. I would have been, to actually live in a society where there's an enormous amount of unity and enormous pressure built around dissenters. I think most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, probably wouldn't have behaved any differently from most of the people there. But perhaps we can talk about that. That violence ultimately escalated into murder. This is a marker to Herbert Lee. This is his wife. Herbert Lee was murdered in Liberty, Mississippi. He had gotten involved with Bob Moses in voter registration. He was at the local cotton gin. A local white man named E.W. Hearst, a state legislator, who had grown up with and knew Herbert Lee, pulled a gun on him and demanded that Herbert Lee get himself out of that civil rights mess. Herbert Lee said to him, "I'm not talking to you till you put that gun away." And he shot him dead on the spot. Herbert Lee's body lay at that cotton gin for 3 hours in front of God and the world.